Traditional therapy can be super harmful to ADHDers. In this episode, we'll unpack how that happens and what to do instead. You'll walk away with clarity around what you truly need to navigate this neurotypical world effectively with your ADHD brain. Be sure to listen. Welcome to the Self-Loved ADHD Woman's Way podcast. I'm your host, Jen Barnes. If you're an ADHD woman entrepreneur, ADHD adjacent, or ADHD-ish, you've come to the right place. We'll dive deep into the unique challenges you face, from the inner turmoil to the outer obstacles. We'll blend neuroscience, IFS, and somatic healing, and explore practical strategies to help you navigate the world of entrepreneurship with ADHD with greater ease and effectiveness. I'm glad you're here. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. I am really excited to talk about this important topic about how traditional therapy can actually be harmful for people identifying as ADHD. And before I get into it, I want to share some context first, because this isn't necessarily the fault of therapists aren't being bad. They're not bad people. They truly want to help. It's just that because of the way we therapists are trained, I'm a coach in this business, I'm a therapist in another. So I can speak to that. The way we're trained is not the way I'm going to talk about later in the episode about how we can help ourselves. So I want to be clear, I'm not bad-mouthing your therapist or anything like that, but rather want to speak to a really big issue in the therapy community around how ADHD is approached. So first, I want to offer some context. The first thing to understand is that in therapy, use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is a manual that contains all of the diagnoses that we can bill under. So if you are seeing someone and using your insurance, you are required to carry a diagnosis. That is in that book. Right now, we're on DSM-5. And the problem this is for people with ADHD is that book is all focused on deficits and how they are not quote unquote normal, how they make you not be like everyone else in society, and how it's a problem. And it basically gives the impression that being neurodivergent is bad and an illness that needs to be fixed or at least coped with. Don't get me wrong, our neurodivergence can create challenges that's important to figure out how to work with so we can navigate this neurotypical world more effectively. But something you'll hear me talk more about later, part of the reason we have such a hard time isn't because there's something wrong with our brain. It's because our brains are different than how society functions at this present time in our history. That's a problem because when therapists are trained to help people based on their quote unquote mental illness, which includes ADHD and autism in the DSM, there is a model of looking at this as dysfunctional, as deficit, versus just a different way of being that people are born with and need help figuring out how to navigate the world. So traditional therapy often gives us the impression that we are somehow dysfunctional or doing it wrong from the get-go. And sure, some of the skills that we learn in therapy can help us get by, but at a cost. Because through these skills and strategies we're taught, especially the social ones, that are basically often trying to make us act more neurotypical, we get the impression that we're fundamentally flawed and need fixing from someone who is supposed to be safe to us, someone we trust. And so then we end up feeling shame, like we're bad because of this apparently fundamental flaw that other people are seeing, which I don't actually think is a fundamental flaw. And so then what we end up doing is we learn how to mask, and then we look like we're quote unquote getting better or we are healing from our ADHD. When the reality is oftentimes we're just masking our symptoms and getting exhausted in the process. We do this so that we can function in society in a way that others approve of, that we don't get in trouble at work, that we don't quote unquote get in trouble socially so that people don't find us annoying, so that people love us and care about us in our natural state. They might not. So then we find ways to mask. And this works for a while. But both personally and professionally, what I've noticed is eventually this masking can lead to anxiety and overwhelm because you're trying so hard to keep up this mask so you don't get in trouble anywhere, and depression. Because, first of all, you can shut down from all of that work and feel depressed. But also, when you're doing all that masking, you might start to lose touch with who you actually are. And you might also lose touch with your gifts of ADHD because you're so busy masking your ADHD to survive neurotypical society that then you don't get to embrace the gifts of your ADHD. And this is not helpful. It's actually harmful. And it actually leads to a lot of people with being on extra medication and feeling really bad about themselves and ashamed, and then not really having good relationships because you have to mask all the time just so people can quote unquote tolerate you. Whereas if you happen to be friends with people who are neurodivergent, then you unmask and you can just be yourself because of the way we communicate differently. It's not looked at as defective or deficient or you need to stop interrupting, but rather understood that a lot of times in ADHD circles, we don't view it as interrupting. We just see conversation as circular and we're just all adding to the same conversation. It's more of a community effort to move the conversation along than people taking turns talking. And when you look at the DSM and when you look at quote unquote treatments for ADHD and even things that teachers try to get you to do when you're in school, they're trying to get you to take turns. They're trying to get you to not interrupt. They're trying to get you to talk like a neurotypical person, which I'm not saying is never useful for us, but if that's all we're doing, we end up masking most of who we are. We end up showing up inauthentically, and then we wonder why we feel so lonely and like we don't have close friends because nobody knows us, because we can't be ourselves and still be loved, or at least that's what we've come to believe because of all of these messages from people who have good intentions to help us, but actually end up harming us in the process. This is really important stuff to understand. So, then what do we do instead? Well, we start with understanding ADHD as a neurodivergence. It's a different way of having a brain. And when you think about evolution, something I learned about in a training on the ADHD brain with David Noel, maybe it's Newell, I might have his name wrong. What we understand is that we needed both kinds of brains back when we were like in tribe type situations. We needed people who are neurotypical to be back at the home site, mending the clothes and doing the cooking and all the regular tasks that they're really good at doing. But we needed people with neurodivergent brains to be out hunting and also spotting danger because our brains, our ADHD brains, take in enormous amounts of stimuli, way more than a neurotypical brain, which in neurotypical society gets problematic sometimes, especially when we're around a lot of people who expect that not to happen. But it can even be hard sometimes when we're trying to stay focused on a task. However, when you're out in the wilderness hunting for food, being able to scan the environment and see everything not only keeps you safe, but it helps you find food for not just you, but your family, the other members in your community. So that ADHD was never wrong. It was actually needed. And it's not a new thing. It's been around since the 18th century. But it's been around before that. It's been recognized, I should say, since the 18th century in modern society. But it was around long before that in these ways. And so when we can start to understand that we actually have gifts that our ADHD brings to the table, our creativity, our playfulness, our spontaneity, our enthusiasm, our ability to take in a lot of information, our ability to take risks so much, our ability to be charismatic and network. We have so many gifts, and you might not have all of those, but there are so many benefits of ADHD. I'm not saying that there aren't challenges. Don't get me wrong. We'll get to that in a moment. It's just that the challenges are not how our brain functions. The challenges are that the way society's set up doesn't match how our brain functions. And so, well meaning therapy protocols try to make our brain be more like how society functions. And I'm not saying that's never useful. Certainly, if you have a job, you're going to have to figure out some ways of masking so that you don't get written up all the time and get fired, right? There's just some things, if you have a job in neurotypical society, you will likely have to figure out how to act more neurotypical in certain settings. It's probably just going to be true. I'm not saying that's fair, but it might be the reality. But the problem with masking is then you're losing touch with some of your gifts. So it's important to figure out a balance with how much you mask and how much you don't. And identifying spaces where you can be fully yourself and then places where you're going to need to mask. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm noticing that at 51, while I'm going through perimenopause still, I'm exhausted from having to mask. And so I am being really intentional about how I spend my free time. That doesn't mean I don't spend time with people or in places where I have to mask, but I don't spend as much time in those places because I don't want my free time to be dominated by places where I can't be myself. Like, why would we want our free time to be dominated by places where we can't just be who we are? I'm really tired of having to act like a therapist because I can mask. And a lot of times in therapy, when I have a neurotypical client, I mask as much as I can without coming across as inauthentic so that they don't feel interrupted because that's how a neurotypical person interprets that. But it's exhausting. And so in our free time, it's important that we find places where we can also just be who we are because there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that neurotypical people expect that we conform to the way their brains are because that's the societal norms at this time in history. They're not bad people. They just don't know that our brains are different and that actually there's nothing wrong with our brains. But it's like there's all kinds of things that we used to think were bad. And now we realize, oh, it's just a different way of being in the world. It's not bad. There's a long list of it. I'm not going to get into that because it's a long list of very sensitive topics that I don't want to unpack, but I think you know what I'm talking about. And so it's really important to find these spaces where you can be completely unmasked, people with whom you can completely unmask, and then really reflect on how much time you want to spend in your free time in places where you have to mask completely. The other piece of this is instead of learning all these tools and strategies to act more neurotypical, it's important to learn tools and strategies to set your life up to work for your brain rather than fighting it all the time. So if you're an entrepreneur, you get to set up your business. You get to figure out what it looks like. So set it up so that it makes sense for your ADHD brain because it's your business. Learn to work the way that works for your brain. Otherwise, you're going to be less productive because you're always fighting with yourself and probably feeling shame because you can't do it. Well, you can't do it because you're not doing it the way your brain works, not because you somehow suck or something. It's about finding the ways to do it that work for you and setting your life and your business up in a way that matches your brain. So what does this look like? So one way I set my life up for my ADHD, I don't require myself to fold my laundry every week. I do try and make myself do it every other week. Otherwise, I get overwhelmed with the pile in the laundry bin. But I only do that every other week. I have it all a special spot where the clean clothes go, so they're easy to access when I get dressed in the morning. But then by week 2, I get sick of having to dig through it, and that stresses me out and dysregulates my nervous system. So then before week 2 starts, I have to make time and do something fun while I fold and put away my laundry, right? Or with my business, I have found a way to do certain tasks when I most feel like it energetically, matching my level of interest and energy to the different tasks. I say no to things that aren't a fit for my brain. I generally don't network with people all that much who aren't also ADHD. I can do that and have done that, but it's exhausting. And so then I need to also then create a lot of space after for me to take care of myself and to unwind. I create hours that work for me. So in both of my businesses, I work 10 to 7, sometimes a little later in this business, my coaching business, but I work hours that work for me. I'm not going to start at 8 o'clock. Are you kidding me? That's crazy for me. I'm actually not going to do that. That doesn't work. You might be a morning person. Great, do that. But for me to start at 10 a.m., that way I can get up and do my morning self-love ritual that also involves a lot of ADHD care. So I'm at my maximum capacity for being able to focus and get stuff done. I use tools and strategies designed for the ADHD brain. And I recommend that you do too. So, one of the things I want to say also about unmasking is starting to learn how to unmask in society requires that you have first figured out how to work with big feelings. And I'm not only talking about your own, because when we show up authentically unmasked, a lot of neurotypical people, even neurodivergent people who have been masking so long, I used to do this. In fact, all this therapy stuff I used to do before I knew better. But I used to do this. I used to get upset when neurodivergent people would unmask, and I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I felt like people weren't following the rules. And now I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I wanna find all those people and go back and apologize." Because here's the thing, when we unmask, either neurotypical people who are not neurodivergent friendly or understand neurodivergence or open to us being neurodivergent, and neurodivergent people who highly mask and believe that's how it has to be, tend to have big feelings when we show up unmasked. And they sometimes can get pretty reactive and strong about it. And then that can trigger our rejection sensitivity. And then we feel not only their big feelings, but our own. And so part of being able to mask in more public spaces, in bigger spaces, is learning how to sort through those big feelings because it's coming. It's going to happen. And if it doesn't for you, comment on this episode. I would love to hear about that. If it's a completely neurotypical space or a place where there's a lot of masking, and when you unmask, no one's got anything to say about it, let me know where that place is. But usually there's a lot of big feelings about it, both theirs and then as a result, your own. So before you start unmasking openly in big, large communities, even like I'm doing here on my podcast, you've got to figure out, you don't have to, but life is going to suck if you don't, figure out how to work with the big feelings. All right. This was a lot of information in a short amount of time. My intention is to help you feel less shame about your ADHD, to start to see how it's actually not bad or like some kind of deficit that needs to be fixed, even though the word deficit is wrongly in the name, but rather just a neurodivergence that has had purpose in society and still does when we are allowed to share it. And then I hope you've also taken away how to start to balance when you mask and when you don't mask so you don't have to be so tired from constantly masking, and to set up your life in a way and your business in a way that actually works for your ADHD brain using tools made for your ADHD brain by people with ADHD brains. Nothing wrong against neurotypical folks, but a lot of times these strategies they come up with don't work for us because they don't have our brain. And that's not like, that doesn't make them defective. But I can't come up with strategies for them all the time either. Actually, I kinda can because a lot of us have been masking as neurotypical for so long, we tend to know a lot of the strategies, right? So I hope you're walking away, whether you were a master masker or never masked, I hope you're walking away with feeling some compassion from me and some validation and some ideas on how to actually navigate this world with your neurodivergent ADHD brain. If you're not following already, I would love it if you would follow this podcast. And heck, I'd even love it more if you leave a review. When you leave a review, when you subscribe or follow, you are having my episodes be seen by more people so that we can help more people like us, more people with ADHD. So I would love it if you would take the time to do that. Believe me, I know your plate is full. I would really appreciate it from one ADHD brain to another. All right, y'all, take care. I'll see you next time.